Every day, everywhere you look, there are stories waiting to be written. It might be yours, it might be the one that's sitting in the back of your friend's mind, or scribbles that someone is frantically writing down while walking to work. If you're watching this, odds are that you're looking to jump or have already jumped into the story industry yourself. Comments on my channel and tweets sent my way are filled with those looking to step into the manga business, saying that I've helped them out with my little slice of the YouTube pie. That's all very cool, and those comments are honestly really special to me. But lately, I've been thinking, I haven't even touched the surface yet. I've talked about certain series, specific panels, aspects of good manga, world building, and quite a few other topics, but I haven't actually gone over how to write a story. Outlines, structure, how about simply getting an idea on paper and expanding upon it? Today, I want to rectify that. Let's talk about actually getting down to the brass tacks of your manga, the thing that draws your readers in. How do you even write a story? For those of you that might have clicked on this and were hoping that there was information here outside of manga, well, you're in luck. The aspects of a good story are the same as any story in any industry, whether it be manga, screenplays, video games, or any narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. To start off the video, I think it will be interesting to do the following. I'm going to work through an idea here in this video specifically, walk you through my thought process, expand on it, and then explain the reasonings for these choices. After that, we're going to look at some different takes on how to write a story's structure and outline. That might be for a short story, a single page or chapter, or an entire novel or tankobon itself. This example will specifically give you the best leg up that I can recommend for someone writing their first manga. At the end, take what you can from each part of the video and implement it into your own style and strategies. Looking at my writing process, I think that the first and most basic necessity that I start with is the idea. This might appear obvious at first, but there's a reason why I bring it up. When I'm writing, I'm not thinking, I want to have a story that covers the moral grounds of humanity and how we as a species sink to violence in a lust for power. I want this to be a statement about mankind and its follies. I'm just thinking about a normal idea and it goes deeper from there. What is something interesting that I can write about? Moreover, and more specifically, what's something that I personally will find interesting to write? You need this to be broad enough to expand upon so you can eventually turn it into something that's exciting and engaging. If you're planting the seed of your story, how will it grow in different directions? What elements are going to be covered? Admittedly, this can be the most difficult part. It's torture to just sit there and keep racking your brain over and over just to try to find the greatest idea you could possibly ever think of. Concept so grand and important that the world couldn't help but read your works. But it usually doesn't come from anything like that. Acts of God shining a light down on you and giving you divine inspiration are pretty rare. Strangely enough, whether I'm writing for an exercise, planning out the next D&D session I'm DMing for, or just fiddling around with a story that I think could possibly be published someday, the start of every one of these stories is, that's kind of weird. It's kind of cool though. I can work with that. Let me write that down and expand on it. Let's work through an example together. Power fantasies are the most popular genre of manga for a reason. There's no shame in adding one more to the pile. Let's look at superpowers. It's entirely too broad and not specific enough to say, I want a story about people with superpowers. That won't point your plot in any specific direction, and in turn, it won't point you in any specific direction when it comes to writing the next part of the plot. The part of bringing an idea from just a small concept to an actual interesting world is that you as an author ask the logical follow-up questions that expand the world you're in turn expand how much we get to know about your characters and their actions. The answers to the following can serve as explanations to how your characters found themselves in their current predicaments, the reasonings for their actions, or even introduce a new obstacle for them to climb. What kind of questions should you ask and answer? They're about how your world is structured based on the situation you've introduced. How much of an advantage is it to get powers in the world you're creating? How much of a disadvantage is it to not get them? Does everyone get the same powers, or are they different? Are there certain ways that people can individualize their powers to fit their personalities and goals? Are the people who get powers part of the majority, or are they part of the minority? How would their world be different from ours if superpowered people are flying, fighting, and destroying cities? Or maybe it's the opposite, where the general public has no idea about these superpowered individuals, and anyone with these gifts has to use them discreetly. There are quite literally endless ways to spread out from the base nugget of ideas, and it's your job to expand on how these play out in the world you're creating. You need to paint the picture for your reader so that they see the world as you're envisioning. Each of these questions lean on the next or might influence another question. You have to put yourself in the reader's shoes and ask the questions that they will inevitably ask. If they're reading your story, they're going to want to know more about your world, which means that they're going to be asking questions. You have to answer those questions. If you don't, and if your explanations are only surface level, you run the risk of your story seeming shallow and not well thought out. In our superpower example, those new ideas usually come from when I'm daydreaming, where I want to be naturally inquisitive and ask questions to myself to let the idea naturally flow from a basic idea to a complex one that can give a deeper meaning to the premise. That in turn will allow me to write more on the subject itself. Make yourself throw paint on the wall and see what sticks. See how you can turn and twist one idea into another more creative one. When coming up with a story like this, I would want to think about scenarios. I personally find it exhausting to drive places. If I'm on a trip where I want to visit family, wouldn't it just be easier to fly? What if I could teleport? Oh man, what if I didn't need to travel at all and I could just telepathically communicate with people instead of driving for 5 hours? It's in a situation like that where my mind would go, what if telepathy could only connect to family members? What would it mean to have this restriction? What if the power gets stronger or weaker depending on how close your blood relation is with them? What if I could have a full conversation with a sibling, but I could only speak a few short words to my cousins? That idea starts just as, I wish that I had superpowers, and ends with the potential for political marriages, empowering a number of influential people into becoming even more powerful and gaining allies with these abilities, political and royal families that act as a hive mind, and so much more. What could I expand with past this? Like we mentioned before, this isn't the single greatest concept in the world, but it is something unique that I can work with and then later expand upon. In expanding, whether you look at markets in the street, armies on the battlefield, or entire political systems, think about how this potential for telepathic communication between a single pair of family members could make a simple situation much more complex and interesting. How is trade affected when two people can communicate silently? What if two battalions of an army have perfect coordination between two family members leading the charge? What ways would arguments between council members change when two people can perfectly coordinate each other to influence the king and react perfectly to new developments? The idea of two minds being better than one becomes a constant threat to those without this ability. Now, if you saw these two concepts without any context, it might seem like an illogical gap between the two, but remember that this was not an A to B flow of ideas. There were many steps that bridged the gap between the two. You need to do the same with your ideas that specify your situation, your story, or world-building element with the same level of detail and care. Make the reader believe that you've thought of all the angles and possibilities with your world. How has your idea affected the world to be different from the one that we already live in? An additional advantage here is that the later option gives someone, whether it be an author or a reader, a lot more to chew on other than just, here is a world with superpowers. Your end goal should be to look at the base idea of something that grabs your attention, in this case superpowers, and then expand on that and make it your own. I'm going to be cool and not give you the English class lesson of inciting incidents, climaxes, and resolutions. I'm going to say that there are dozens of videos on YouTube that go into guides to how to write acts in a story. Instead, I think for your first few stories, you're going to have a much easier time if you follow the advice of Brandon Sanderson, author of the Mistborn series. In a video I'll link below, he says to try and fit your story into the existing structure of a genre that interests you and borrow its outline. Even if you don't have a specific worthwhile idea, you can just use this as a guiding post in terms of writing the beginning, middle, and end bones of your story and being able to add deeper meanings and ideas later on. Add the meat onto these bones with the ideas you've come up with from earlier in the video, the characters you want to explore, and the lessons that you want to include. He brings up the example of a heist story. If you like the idea of a heist, there are overarching plot points of every heist story in the history of the genre. There's always going to be a gathering of a crew, finding people with different talents, and having them apply their talents to the situation at hand. Every heist has these scenes at the highest level, no matter how different their plots are overall. One can be robbing a joint for diamonds, and the other can be stealing money underneath Charlotte Motor Speedway. Now, I know that this advice might seem contrary to my What Makes Good Manga video, where we discuss that your work should be individualized and specifically not be a carbon copy of someone else's work, but try to think about this a little differently. Sanderson, and myself if that's worth anything compared to a famous professional author, aren't saying to just start making carbon copies of every famous story and then releasing them to the public. What is being said is that if you're writing a story for the first time, you just need to practice writing. You need to see how acts flow from one piece to another. To put it extremely bluntly, your first story probably isn't going to be released anytime soon, if at all. It's a hard pill to swallow. There's a certain amount of pride and honor that makes you want to say that you nailed it on the first try, but the world doesn't roll that way. Although, with that being said, I want you to keep up hope. Your first story probably won't be released, but your best story might be. And the only way to get there is by writing your first, second, third, 10th, and 22nd story. At that point, you'll look back and you'll see how much you've improved from one story to another, especially from your first to your current work. So to get to that point, and to find your best story, you need to start writing. And by writing, I mean actually writing. You're writing in dialogue, narration, descriptions, the ways that characters move, act, and feel. Take a lesson from Sanderson if you're new to this. Take the general qualities and highlights from your favorite story, the ones at the highest levels, and just swap out the characters, locations, and events. Give yourself the best possible start. You deserve it. 99.99% of the people who say they're going to start writing a manga or a novel don't do it, plain and simple. An even smaller percentage gets published. Give yourself every advantage to become part of the 0.01%. After you've gotten a few stories under your belt, it's time to take off the training wheels and start looking at how you want to write your stories, and determine what kind of author or mangaka you want to be. According to George R.R. Martin, there are two different kinds of authors. There are architects, and then there are gardeners. The architect knows exactly when and how things are going to happen. They have a very specific plot line that is being followed beat for beat. The who, what, and where is already exactly determined at every stage of the story. But George R.R. Martin says that he is much more of a gardener. He has a general plotline in mind, he knows the broad sweeping strokes of the story and what characters end up where, but the in-between surprises him. He plants the seeds of the characters and they grow in ways that he did not expect. People that turn from a one-dimensional good or bad guy becomes deep and complex. The idea that he could have written down what every single person does at every point would have been impossible, and that's why he, allegedly, needs so much more time to flesh out these characters and to write these books. He does clarify that it's impossible to be 100% architect or 100% gardener. It's more about which direction you lean. It's extremely important to note, however, that neither is correct or incorrect just by their own merit. The right option comes from how well you slot into that style as an author. After you've gotten a few stories under your belt, and after you've written a few of them fully, see which way you lean towards, and either pull out your blueprints or grab a rake. So, in looking at writing your first story, I would say you should walk away with this. First, you need a concept. In creating something unique and special, it's a way to get into a deeper concept, topic, or lesson. By asking yourself the hard questions about the concept you're putting out there and answering those in kind, you're going to give yourself a real, genuine idea that puts you on the first step towards creating something worthwhile. After, when looking at an outline, give yourself every advantage possible. Look at the type of story you want to write, the power fantasy, romance, thriller, horror, and look at what made the successful versions of those stories successful. Swap out parts of those stories with your own and write in your own dialogue, characters, and situations. In what ways do you follow the plots of the outline you're borrowing? In what ways do you differ? After you have some experience under your belt, then you can look at starting fresh from the ground up and see if you're a gardener or an architect. But in terms of getting something together now, give yourself the edge to succeed. Borrow an outline and work with it. It's after this, you're going to see that you have a very significant chunk of the work done. With an actual written story in hand, you're going to be able to evolve this piece of art from words on a page to panels in manga. The first step is getting there. I'll leave you with this. It's really hard to draw panels, characters, designs, and then staging, framing, and nailing down the style of your manga without a roadmap. Once the starting portion of the writing is done, you can take the next step into drawing your first manga. But that's a video for another time. But I hope you stick around to see it. Push past looking at an outline without any ideas to fill it. Just write and let your own sense of judgment put you in the best position possible to either write more on your first story or to someday start your best story. If you liked this, remember to like and subscribe, and feel free to follow on Twitter. Thanks again for watching. This was Panel Flow.